Sup, y'all? It's me. It's your boy Asmongold, and today I want to talk to you guys about my first impressions with Antorus the Burning Throne. Now, as soon as I woke up on Tuesday, I was already hyped up. I got a drink, I got some food, I got on my stream, I got a group, and we did the raid as soon as it was released, and we cleared it pretty fast. We were not the first people, but we were fast enough to where whenever we actually killed Argus, there still weren't any cinematics on Reddit or on MMO Champion or anything, so everybody was going into this blind. Nobody knew what to expect, and oh my god, the hype was fucking real whenever we finally saw Sargeras. And I was so happy, and honestly, guys, I think that Antorus is the best raid that Legion has had, right? I think by a mile, it's much better, not only from a mechanical perspective, but also from a lore perspective. And whenever you take into consideration all of the other raids that we've had beforehand, I would say that there hasn't been a raid that's been this cataclysmic and this momentous, and this much of a turning point in Warcraft's history since ICC, whenever we killed the Lich King. Whenever you think about it, imprisoning Sargeras, which is what happened, spoilers, by the way, imprisoning Sargeras, ending the Burning Crusade. I mean, this shit's been going on for like over 10 years, and now it's over, right? And apparently it's been going on in the game for like 10,000, okay? And so ending that, and I mean, like, demons, the Burning Crusade, Kil'Jaeden, Archimonde, Sargeras, like, they had been like the big bad guys for the game for years, right? Decades at this point. Maybe not decades, but at least a decade. And actually being able to kind of, at least in a small sense, put an end to that story, close the book on that story, is a huge turning point for the game. And I'm not saying if it's a good or a bad thing, but I'm saying it is a very, very big deal. Okay, so I thought that was really, really important. I think a lot of people feel the same way. I think a lot of people are really excited to see what's going to happen on Mythic Antorus, specifically on Argus, because at 40%, instead of him just killing the raid and ANR resurrecting everybody, there's some secret Mythic only phase, and I feel like Sargeras will probably play some part in that, and I'm very looking forward to seeing what the people in like whatever guild clears it first are able to show me what's going to happen, right? Because it's certainly not going to be me. So anyway, going back to the mechanics, whenever I look at Tomb of Sargeras, you know, from like a distance, and I look at all of the different fights, and I compare them to the raids in like Nighthold, the raids in Tomb of Sargeras, especially, one of the biggest things that stands out to me is that so many of the mechanics in Antorus are not necessarily personal responsibility, and they're also not personal responsibility in the way that, let's say, Derpy McDumbass in your raid decides to not stand in Armageddon, or he pulls the boss away on Avatar, or he runs into somebody else in Grand Conjunction on Staraugur. That is an instant raid wipe, right? It just completely ends the fight, and you have to do it all over again just because one person wanted to be stupid. I didn't see as many of those mechanics in Antorus, and I feel like whenever Ian did the most recent Q&A, he talked specifically about trying to remove mechanics that are punishing for the entire raid whenever one person makes a mistake. I feel like fights like that are very unfun and unrewarding to progress on, and I'm very glad that Antorus has taken a step away from that. And I feel because of that, we're going to see a lot more people progressing in Antorus, and we're also going to see people feeling like that progression is more meaningful and the progression is more enjoyable. I don't really think it's very fun for you to just be basically waiting around, like on Staraugur, for example, just waiting around for somebody to mess up Grand Conjunction. And as soon as they mess it up, it's like a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, basically. And there are a lot of fights like that in Legion, and I feel like those fights were not fun, they were not compelling, and they were not enjoyable at all. And of course you can make arguments like, oh, you should get better raiders, etc. For one, anybody making that argument has probably never been in a raiding guild. But on top of that, it's a lot more complicated than that, and everybody does make mistakes. And I feel like the mechanics that the raids before Antorus have had were very unfun and punishing, and as I said, I one of the big reasons why I stopped raiding in Tomb of Sargeras is because of those types of mechanics. It just wasn't fun for me to keep doing them over and over, just waiting for everybody to not make a mistake collectively, right? It just wasn't fun. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and talk about Antorus, go through all the different fights, talk about what I liked, talk about what I didn't like. Now, in terms of the scenery, I feel like all the time I talk about what it would be like and how much I would like to see a WoW 2, World of Warcraft 2. Not just, you know, a new expansion, but an entirely new game with updated graphics and anything like that. And I'll be honest, guys, as soon as we walked into that Aggramar room, I felt like I was playing it, man. Like, holy shit. Like, some of the parts in Antorus were absolutely incredible. It really made me feel like this was a completely different game than what we had seen before. And I feel like, especially, like, beyond Ken Garoth, I think after you kill him, you go into, like, this, I don't know, it's like a temple, kind of, where you fight, like, Virathamiris, the Covenantervara, Aggramar, and then you go somewhere else to fight Argus and the Pantheon. All of those fights, the way that they were designed and the way that the whole room looked, it just looked like it was a completely different game. And I mean that in the best way possible. It looked fucking incredible. So I think that in terms of aesthetics, Antorus was an amazing raid. I think a lot of people have kind of gotten sick of the fell theme, and about halfway through the raid, like, I'm not a person that really cares a lot about that kind of stuff, but I still was seeing, like, okay, yeah, it's another green boss. Okay, it's another green boss. Oh, it's a green guy. I see. Okay, he's green. Okay. Oh, this one's purple. You know, and it was just all the same fell stuff over and over and over, and I thought that was kind of boring. But moving into those later fights, that was just a completely different change of scenery and everything. I thought it was absolutely amazing. So the first boss, the Garathi Worldbreaker, I mean, it's the first boss, right? I mean, it's a big fell reaver, he does some dumb shit, and then you kill him, right? I mean, he's the boss that everybody's probably going to one-shot on Mythic next week. He's not very hard at all. And I feel like, I mean, for first bosses, the only first boss that I really didn't like was Hellfire, the Hellfire Assault in HFC, because I just thought it was boring. But I do think that Garathi Worldbreaker was a very, very good first boss, and the mechanics were, they were important, and they had consequence to them, but they were not necessarily hard to avoid or tricky, or there was nothing that was really fundamentally unfair about the boss. Everything bad that would happen to you on that boss was entirely your fault. And I did like that a lot. So I thought the Garathi Worldbreaker was a great boss. I also like being able to kill him and then go past him. It reminded me a lot of, Kolagharn in Ulduar. After you kill him, you can, like, use his body as a bridge to go to the inner circle of Ulduar. So that kind of reminded me a little bit of Ulduar. And then going into the Hounds of Sargeras, the only thing that disappointed me about this boss is that I didn't get the mount. So that was not really too good, but of course I'm going to be running it on every single character until I get it, so I'm not too worried either way. But anyway, the boss itself was pretty interesting. I liked kind of keeping them together and making them do more damage and being able to cleave them down, and then also spreading them apart if you wanted to, if you needed to, have better survivability for your raid, or you just couldn't really deal with that much damage. I mean, these are like very, very entry-level bosses, so it's not like any of them had any sort of very complicated mechanics or anything that you really had to watch out for or you had to study for, but I felt like they were in general just very good entry-level bosses. The third boss that we did, I think was Portal Keeper Hazabel, because you can either do her or you can do the Antoran High Council, and we just went over to Portal Keeper because that was the first place that I saw to go to, so I'm like, alright, everybody go over here. Portal Keeper was a good boss as well. I didn't really like a lot of the going to the different portals. I thought that was kind of annoying and having to deal with the different debuffs. But I think that's more or less just my perspective on things, and I thought the fight was pretty good. I don't really like fights with limited visibility, so fighting the shadow, there's like a mini boss, right? You fight like a fire mini boss, I guess like a poison mini boss, and then also like a shadow Nazrium mini boss. And like not being able to see him, not being able to heal people, I thought that was kind of annoying. But I can see how some of that is okay in a very, very limited setting. So I thought the fight was pretty good. Besides that, I would say the fight was pretty good. Besides that, the Antoran High Council, I really like that fight because on normal mode you can just get into one of the pods and then just hit one the entire time, and you're pretty much done with the fight. It's great, but I thought it was interesting. I did it a little bit on Hurlock. We have not killed it yet on Hurlock because I've just been pugging the raid. I didn't really think it was like too amazingly like incredible or anything like that, but I do feel like that using the different pods and fighting the different bosses, rotating, and then also using the pods and rotating on the pods on Heroic, I felt like that was kind of annoying to do, but also I thought it was interesting to have that mechanic in the game. And in terms of like summoning the ads like that, I think that as things go on, the Antoran High Council is probably one of the only bosses that does have that personal responsibility where one person can fuck up the whole raid. If, like, let's say you have, like, they do, like, this big AoE thing, and you have to put down shields, and you click on the shields to activate them, but anybody can click on a shield. So if you have some guy that clicks on a shield early, it can wipe the whole raid. And I think that is kind of boring, but for the most part, I do think that it was a good fight, and I did like the pod mechanic and all of that. Now, the next one is ANR. Now, I didn't really know what to expect for this because I didn't read about the fights at all. But the ANR fight is a lot like one of those tower defense games that you probably played whenever you were trying to slack off in school and trying to figure out how to play flash games instead of actually do your work. And I thought it was pretty fun. I mean, like, the tower defense games were always kind of interesting to me. I remember they used to have, like, a mini game for that back in Warcraft 3. And so seeing the tower defense, I guess, like, the paradigm kind of combined with actually being a boss fight where you kind of have to jump around the room and you have like these wings that will carry you around the room and you have to fight different bosses, and then ranged have to kill the flying ads, and then melee have to fight other mobs that you have to interrupt. I feel like the boss or the encounter wasn't really a boss. The encounter itself was very rewarding and I did enjoy it a lot. I thought it was going to be a lot more annoying than it was, but I do like ad fights in a way. I didn't really like Galacras or, like, as I said, Hellfire Assault, but there have been other ad fights in the game that I have enjoyed a lot, and, like, Spoils of Pandaria was pretty fun for me. So I feel like ANR was probably one of the best versions of an ad fight that I've seen so far, but until I get into Heroic and Mythic, it's going to be hard to tell what the real differences between, like, those two fights are and normal mode, right? Because normal mode is usually very, very easy. Now, after that, I think that we moved over to, what was his name? Imonar, who is kind of like a bounty hunter, I guess. So he's like Han Solo or something. I don't even know if Han Solo was a bounty hunter, but either way, he's basically just teleports from one end of like this bridge to another, and whenever you go from like one end to another and he like teleports over there, it doesn't teleport, he actually flies. Whenever he flies over there, he casts a spell that you have to interrupt, and he puts a bunch of different, I guess, like traps on the ground, and you have to either like avoid the traps or like run through them, I guess, like tactically to clear them from the rest of the raid. I feel like Imonar, that type of mechanic is kind of funny, because a lot of the traps just do damage to each individual player that gets hit, not the entire raid. And so it's kind of funny to see people who have no fucking idea what's going on just running right through the traps, right? So I think that just for that alone, Imonar was a very, very good fight. I thought that some of the mechanics, like they had like these little ships that would like assist him and they'd shoot beams at people, so he had to push the beams away from the raid. I thought that was kind of interesting too, but I could see where it would also be very annoying. But I thought the fight overall was pretty good. It was probably one of the mid-level fights. It wasn't like one of my absolute favorites, but it was also not one of the ones that I didn't really like a lot. Now, the next fight, Kengaroth. And this one, whenever I started reading about it right before we basically did it, I thought it was going to be really cool because it's like this guy who's like the master engineer for all of the different mechanics and like machines in the Legion. So he's like summoning these different like Fel Reavers, and you have like these balls that are rotating around the room that you're supposed to not hit. And he has a beam that he shoots out that, of course, everybody fucking dies to. And I felt like the fight was very good too. I liked the idea whenever he would summon these different ads, and he would summon them, and it would be either one or another that you could basically kill. And the faster you get to them, they have a buff that makes them take more and more damage, and that buff diminishes over time. So the faster you get to them, the more that you can take advantage of that buff, and the more powerful that buff will be against dealing damage to that mob. So I really did like that because it encourages people to move over and fight the ads as soon as possible. A lot of times you have people that are kind of just like they pretty much just ignore the ads and just focus down and tunnel the boss. I think everybody knows people like that. And I'm very glad that Kengaroth actually had a mechanic that if you really care a lot about your damage, that's the exact opposite of what you're going to do. I thought the fight in general was very fun. I did think it was kind of annoying that Kengaroth did have like a melee attack that would hit, I guess, like the tank and then also everything around him, while at the same time the tank could also be tanking the one of the Fel Reavers, and so the melee might accidentally get hit by that based on their positioning. I don't really know if that's like an L2P situation or not, but it did seem to be kind of annoying. But other than that, Kengaroth was probably one of my favorite fights in Antorus by far. I really just liked the fight. I liked the theme of the fight. I liked everything about it. Now, the next one, this is whenever we moved from, I guess, like everything being green and purple to everything being red. So, the first fight that we fought over here, first fight we did over here, was the Coven of the Chiavari. Now, this fight is annoying as fuck. Like, this is the one fight, like, I know that, okay, yeah, there's a lot of mechanics and they're really hard to do and it's a mechanic fight and, you know, like, alright, whatever, but I didn't fucking like this fight. It was annoying, and then you had the Norgannon add, so it spawned, and then the whole raid died, and the what was it, Amonthul or Khaz'goroth, what one of the Titans that was shoot a lightning bolt at everybody and it would chain off to everybody because nobody decided to fucking spread out, and then they all died, and I was just like, okay, this is really annoying, but the fight was okay. Okay, the fight was okay. And then it's even worse because then if you have the two ads together, then they become immune basically to damage, and it's just like, it's one of those fights where like it's really fun to do if everybody is really good, but if they're not, you get mad, okay? You get mad. So I think that the fight, like, I don't hate mechanics fights, but the mechanics fight make me hate the people that I'm playing with. I think that's the best way to say it. And so the Coven of Chiavari, I think, will make me angry at a lot of people. We just say that. The next fight, Verathamiris. And Verathamiris is, like, imprisoned by the Coven of the Chiavari, whatever, because he's basically a dumbass, right? And they just wanted to torture him, and, you know, they're mean. So he's down there at the bottom, and he has, like, this mechanic where, like, if you don't stand next to other people, you have, like, this, he'll, like, attack you, and he'll deal shadow damage to you. And whenever he deals shadow damage to somebody, it puts a debuff on them, and that debuff makes them pretty much unhealable for a certain amount of time. So that means that if you make a mistake, it's very obvious that you made the mistake, and you are the one that suffers for that mistake. And I like that a lot. Because it makes it very clear to know who's fucking up, and it also makes it very clear for that person to know that they're making the mistake, and hopefully they can be able to improve on it. As I said before, a lot of the fights that we've had before this in Legion, there have been so many of them that just punish every single person whenever one guy fucks up. And Verathamiris, I think, is probably the best example of the complete antithesis of that, where if one person makes a mistake, that is completely on them. And I do like that a lot. In terms of the fight mechanics, he did like 3 things. Like, he does like a debuff on the tank, you got a tank swap, you put some balls on the ground, you move out of them, and then he puts a line on a guy and then he knocks him back, right? It's really not a big deal. And I don't mind that either, man. I really don't. So I feel like in general, Verathamiris was a good fight. Definitely was. It's again one of those fights where you can tell, you can take somebody to that fight, especially probably on Heroic and Mythic, and you'll be able to tell very quickly if that person is competent and if they're paying attention, right? Now, after we killed him, we went over to Aggramar, and whenever we were walking up to Aggramar, right, you see him, and then there's like this giant cosmos, like, constellation thing behind him. And this is what I was talking about before. Whenever I saw this, I was like, oh my god, like, this is like WoW 2. Like, we're playing it right now. And I thought that the whole, like, the aesthetic of what I would expect to fight Aggramar the Titan was exactly what I would expect in my mind. And I think that was probably the coolest part about it. I mean, you're fighting him in this unholy demon, like, kind of, I don't even know, like the sacred ground for unholy demons, and it was just really, really, it was really cool. Like, the entire, the ground, or not ground, but the everything that was around you while you were fighting him was really, really cool. Like, the scenery and all of that, I really like that, probably the most on Aggramar than really any other fight, even more than Argus in a way. So that was one thing that I really did like about Aggramar. I also like the, I don't know how to pronounce the name of his sword, and I guess I'll probably have to figure it out whenever I get it. But I think it's called Taisalak, or Taisalak, something like that. And he does an ability where it's kind of a lot like the mobs in the, what is it? in Mogushan Vaults, the Twin Emperors, where they did like the different combo abilities, but instead of them being things that you have to avoid, they're things that the tank has to deal with. So one of them is just a tank ability that you have to use cooldowns for to absorb and not die from, and the other one you have to point towards the raid. So you have the tanks moving them back and forth, people making sure that they're not in for certain mobs or certain attacks, and they are in for certain other attacks. And I feel like that type of mechanic, I thought it was really cool. I did like it. It was probably one of the most interesting mechanics that they had in the fight, and I just, in general, did like the fight. I liked the way that you're handling the different ads. I just thought it was pretty cool. It was pretty much what I would expect from fighting Aggramar. And I think that that was one of the big things that I really liked about this this raid, is that whenever I saw the bosses, and it was like, what would it be like fighting a Fel Reaver as a raid boss, like the Garathi Worldbreaker? And I felt like whenever I was fighting these bosses, they were doing what I would expect them to do. And I don't know if that's kind of a weird thing or not, but that's the way that I felt. Now, going forward, and after we killed Aggramar, we obviously talked to Magni, and he ports us up to the seat of the Pantheon. You've got all of the different, you've got like the mini cinematic where you have like Argus spawn out of, I don't know, like thin air or something. You have all the different Titans sitting around, and you're fighting Argus. You're sitting there right in front of a Titan, basically. And I thought that was fucking amazing. Like, just being there for the first time was completely hype. Now, the fight itself, I didn't really, like, the fight was cool, right? I mean, I didn't really, like, think that it was absolutely, like, incredible or anything like that, but I did really like the fight. I thought that the different types of mechanics that he was doing with, like, the Cone of Death, and then making sure that you're moving in, and then using the different other Titans with their abilities, it reminded me kind of Yogg-Saron, right? Where you have the different keepers that are aiding you. And obviously you can't turn off the Titan's abilities like you could with Ulduar, but there are a lot of similarities between that and fighting Yogg-Saron, at least in my opinion. So I did like that. I like the fact that he killed everybody at 40%, and then ANR had to res everybody up, and you had to use the tree. And then there were swirlies again on the ground that if you stood in them, they would just pretty much kill you if you got more than one stack. And then you'd have to heal yourself up with the tree again. I kind of like that as like the last part of the boss just being a complete just fucking shit show where you're actually pretty much planning for people to die, and that's completely okay. And you're also dealing with these different orbs that you have to kill before they completely engulf the entire room and kill everybody. I thought in general the Argus fight was good, but it just wasn't my favorite fight in the raid. I think that probably Kengaroth or Aggramar were probably my favorite fights, but this is only going off of my normal mode experience so far. I'm probably going to clear Heroic and maybe Mythic. I don't know if I'm going to raid yet, but either way, I haven't cleared either one of those bosses on Heroic or Mythic yet, so I'll have to see if things change since then. I also like fighting all the different little Algalon guys in the transition. I thought that was kind of funny with like the different, like they were vulnerable to different types of magic. Reminded me a lot of course, Chromagus. And finally, whenever we killed Argus, and I didn't know what was going to happen, and the cinematic pops up, right? And you know, you've got Illidan talking to the Keepers, and a lot of this stuff had already been data mined, so I knew that Illidan would end up being the jailer for Sargeras, but I didn't really know if we were going to even see Sargeras in the game, because all this time, up until now, we had not seen Sargeras at all. But I had a really good feeling that we would, because on the key art for patch 7.3, they actually did have an artistic representation, a picture of Sargeras there. So I thought that if they were going to draw him out and actually, you know, like, yeah, this is what the guy looks like, we will probably see him at some point or another. And I was totally fucking right. And whenever they pulled Sargeras down and they imprisoned him in the Pantheon, I thought that was absolutely amazing. He stabs Azeroth with the gigantic sword. All of that was completely cool. It was probably one of the best cinematics that they've done. I think it's probably the best one. In my mind, it's probably the best one that they've had in Legion by a mile. I thought the Kil'jaeden one was also very good, with like Kil'jaeden and Valen talking, but that was only a very small part of it. The only thing that really disappointed me about the cinematic is that there wasn't really a lot of character development. Like, you're finishing up a story that's been going on for like 13 years. You have Sargeras, who they've kind of turned from being like basically the devil to being like a an evil neutral, like I guess like Dungeons and Dragons like alignment, or I guess it would be like lawful evil, where he's just killing everybody to prevent the spread of corruption by the Void Lords. And so I was disappointed that there wasn't more personification of that. There wasn't any dialogue referencing that. There was no talk of that. And it disappointed me a lot because it reminded me a lot of what happened with Garrosh. Garrosh, whenever the Warlords of Draenor cinematic came out, you had Garrosh pull the fucking hood off. He's like, times change, right? And it just seems like, okay, he's this noble savage, and he's actually like very intelligent and smart, but he's also kind of a brute at the same time. And I really liked that dichotomy with how they presented Garrosh in the cinematic. But then in the actual game, Garrosh just seemed to be like this big angry asshole. And I think that's kind of what happened with Sargeras too, because there were so many other things that they could have talked about, so many other things that they could have done. And I feel like if the cinematic had been 10 minutes long, it would have been a million times better. Now, obviously, I know that they can't make 10-minute cinematics every single time, but I would really like to see a little bit more fleshing out of that story and a little bit more explanation as to, like, why did Illidan even have to stay there and imprison Sargeras, because the Titans were doing that. Like, it didn't really make a lot of sense. It didn't make sense that... a lot of it did not make sense, right? Especially to somebody who doesn't really know the story. And I feel like that's probably the worst part, is that if somebody didn't know the story, I don't think that would make a lot of sense to them. For somebody like me that pays attention to it and knows what's going on, obviously, I've got a pretty good idea of like why everything happened. But even with that, I feel like the cinematic missed out on so many very, very crucial elements and so many crucial, I guess, like plot devices and storylines and motivations that were present in the game. They've always been present, but they really weren't very... they just weren't fleshed out. And this is like the last time that we'll probably ever see Sargeras or Illidan in a very long time, until they probably make a Void Lord expansion in 5 years or something, and then bring back Illidan again, and maybe also Sargeras as like being a good guy. But until then, we're probably not going to see a lot of them. So I'd really like to see a little bit more fleshing out. Maybe, if they had like a pre-expansion event thing or something, or just even like an NPC dialogue that kind of explained what happened and why it happened. I feel like that would be good for a lot of casual players, just so they can get a better understanding of the raid and why it happened and everything else in between it. So that's my opinion on Antorus. I think that in terms of the mechanics were much stronger, much better, much more rewarding to deal with than the mechanics in Tomb of Sargeras, and also the mechanics in Nighthold. Tomb of Sargeras, much more the case though. And in terms of the bosses, as I said, I really, really did enjoy the art of the raid, especially the end part. And I think that the raid in general was very, very amazing. I loved the raid. I really enjoyed doing it. I've already done it 3 or 4 times, and I'm not even tired of it yet. Compare that to Tomb of Sargeras, I did it like once or twice and I was done. So the only thing that I thought was kind of a negative is that there wasn't more of the backstory that was fleshed out during the cinematic. That was the only thing that I was disappointed about, but even with that, I thought the cinematic was pretty good. Especially with Sargeras. So anyway, guys, that's my experience, that's my opinion, that's what I think, that's my first impressions of Antorus, the Burning Throne. Great raid. I actually do look forward to progressing on it, which is something that I have not said in a very, very long time. So hopefully Mythic won't be that much different than Heroic and Normal mode, but we'll have to see. Anyway, guys, I'd like to hear what your opinions are. What were your impressions? What did you think about the raid, the story, and everything else in between? Go ahead and let me know, but thank you very much for watching, and like, comment, and subscribe.